Yeah, okay, great. So today I will be presenting on behalf of my co-authors, that's Professor Marilyn Clark, Dr. Lambrini Papadopoulou and Dr. Theodora Maniou, and we conducted this study together, but unfortunately they are not able to join us today. So it's due to various other commitments, a very busy time of the year. So I will present the findings on behalf of all authors that were involved in this study. So to begin with, thank you, William, for this introduction. The focus of this paper is more on rather than on the business pressure or platform, is more on the beyond. So including a lot of, politics in the paper. But before I go into the findings of the study, just to introduce a little bit of brief context. So as many of you know, and I'm sure that you've seen a lot of work in the past few years, the pandemic actually created the what has been described in the literature as the perfect storm, and that involved a lot of issues that hit media outlets almost all at once. The main one being economic hardship, particularly of independent national and local outlets. In many countries, there were media closures, pay cuts to reporters, in some cases job losses, and worsening of working conditions for reporters. And of course, the pandemic also saw the introduction of new threats to press freedom because of government restrictions that limited access of journalists to their sources on which they depended for accurate and truthful reporting in the public interest. And the pandemic also saw cases where journalists were attacked and a huge increase of online abuse of journalists. So, of course, these new challenges to press freedom and journalism practice warrant, further investigation and more in-depth investigation by scholars. When you look across the literature and research that has been conducted and published in the last few years, we notice a pattern of national studies on the pandemic's impact on journalism and newsroom practices. There's a lot of studies from countries across the world, examples, of how journalists in those countries managed to navigate the pandemic and address and respond to these challenges. What we noticed that comparative research was relatively rare. So this is why we wanted this is what we wanted to do. So the aims of the study was to address that gap in comparative research, but specifically focus it on the region of Southeast Europe. So to map out the impact of these external political, economic, legal, and societal factors on the ways that news organizations and journalists tend to operate and respond to these challenges in times of crisis. In other words, what happened during the pandemic, but the focus also was on the post-pandemic context, just because there was emerging evidence that some of these threats to press freedom and challenges to journalism practice have actually become quite embedded in a post-pandemic context. So we wanted to examine if that's the case. And the region is also understudied. So we wanted to make a contribution to research to find out what's happening in those four countries. So our research questions were focused on pandemic and post-pandemic development in journalistic freedom and in Bulgaria, Cyprus, Greece, and Malta, and how these are shaped by contextual factors in these countries. Our second research question is how journalism practice and actually day-to-day operation of news media organization has been impacted by the pandemic, and of course it's continued after. So the study, it was actually conducted, the design conducted in 2022, so that's 2 years from the onset of the pandemic. So just to give you a little bit on the theoretical framework. So there's an argument that perhaps it's difficult to compare these four countries. It's not the standard way that scholars have compared them. mostly because Cyprus, Greece, and Malta, we turned into the models introduced by Hannah Mancini in 2004, and where Cyprus, Greece, and Malta tend to be part of the polarized pluralist media model, whereas Bulgaria is a former communist country that usually tends to get compared against other in Eastern Europe. Or these countries quite often actually have been described as a part of the hybrid media system. And they're defined as having elements from Hannah Mancini's liberal media system and the polarized media system. So according to that classification, we kind of started from there, because there's like 4 key aspects or 4 key variables that can be useful and can be applied for any comparison. The degree of state intervention in the media, the extent of political pluralism, and the growth of media markets and professionalization of journalism. So we did actually find it useful, especially because one of our collaborators, Theodora Maniou, had done quite a bit of work on that already. So looking first at this state intervention across all 4 countries, there's various forms of state intervention that can have an impact on press freedom, and these are common in all of our 4 countries. So that includes, for example, state advertising that can be targeting and given only allocated to friendly media outlets to the government, but also to various business and other actors. State intervention in the form of public security laws that perhaps prohibit journalists from accessing certain sources and conducting their day-to-day jobs. Other forms include state funding of public service broadcasters, which is not necessarily a negative state intervention, but is considered to be an intervention. And of course, safety measures introduced during the pandemic that had significant impact on press freedom. So coming to political pluralism, so degrees to which party system is mirrored in the media, we found that also, if you look across the literature, that is seen to be high in all 4 countries where political, where specific news outlets and publications tend to support political parties. In countries like Bulgaria, for example, they tend to support the agendas through various mechanisms of owners and their political circles. When it comes to the development of media market, each of these countries follow a different path due, of course, to their social-political evolutions. But in countries like Greece and Cyprus, for example, the media markets are highly concentrated, while in Bulgaria, the reforms to the media markets started relatively late. So, and finally, for professionalism, so there's a low level of autonomy as a result of that instrumentalization of public and private media outlets. In many cases, that manifests itself in bias in content, but also self-censorship that journalists practice, and the media being used to serve corporate and other agenda. So that's kind of starting point from the literature. And of course, because of our research questions, we also wanted to look to see what sort of threats to media freedom have been identified in the literature so far. So of course that, as we heard already in the first panel, and many of you here, are focused on that work, you will know that pressures and threats targeting journalists can take a variety of forms that can include physical, psychological, political, financial, technological, judicial, gender and identity-based intimidation, just to name a few. So again, because of the nature of the study and our research question, we wanted to focus on economic and social cultural context, in order to examine that sort of link between media and politics, that relationship. So we looked into literature there that notices that observes pay cuts and job losses and worsening job conditions for journalists in countries across Europe. Another thing of note was that government funds were allocated in biased and non-transparent and often unfair way, mainly for those that were supportive of the government or did not challenge any of their policies, or those that were owned by political parties. But in Bulgaria, for example, there was no support scheme for media houses specifically. When it comes to the political context, the pandemic was seen as a justification to actually suppress critical journalism. So new threats to media, pluralism emerged basically from that specific lack of transparency, media ownership, from countries like Greece and Cyprus with really highly concentrated markets, but also the very poor sustainability of media industry and the lack of business model that made their operation viable, and of course the impact of a commercial interest on editorial content was on the rise. And finally, the legal and safety contents. Again, findings from literature have indicated that illegal threats are increasingly used as a weapon of choice to silence media and journalists, and also increase in abusive use of strategic lawsuit against public participation, otherwise known as SLAPs, with, of course, huge claims for damages that have the potential. In fact, they do silence media journalism, but whole media outlets. Something to note, of course, is the growing number of attacks and threats to journalism because of their work, both off and online. So this is our sort of theoretical framework. When it comes to method, we, again, just to go back to the justification for the comparison, we wanted to follow up in the step of previous research, so kind of that has used the concept of hybridity to compare media systems that have those mixed characteristics. They do have a lot in common, but of course we needed to be mindful of their unique context, political, historical, and social and cultural differences. So we sort of adopted hybridity as a hybrid combination of media system with democratic and undemocratic institutions and practices that has been used by previous studies. So in order to answer research questions, it was really important to speak to journalists, really, those who were on the front line during the pandemic, but also post-pandemic, so they can give us their account and their observation of what actually happened during the worst of times, such as lockdown, but also whether any of those threats remain post-pandemic. So we conducted 32 semi-structured qualitative interviews between May and August 2022. So each one of us conducted interviews in their countries in the native languages of the interviews. So we had to keep those anonymous and confidential because some of these topics are quite challenging. And another thing to note, of course, these are small countries, especially in the case of Malta, where media outlets and people know each other really well. So we have to be quite careful with that. Once we had the interviews, we met as a team and decided to do deductive thematic analysis. We kind of start from the premise that we adopt some themes from the review of the literature, and that's going to guide the coding of our data. So we followed a procedure by stages, which was recommended by Brown and Clark. So the codes were basically derived from previous studies, but also from our expert knowledge, because each one of us had conducted studies specifically on the pandemic in each of these countries and how that's impacted journalism. So we familiarized ourselves with the data, with the reading the transcription. We had several discussions among the research team, and following this, we coded to develop these shorthand labels that describe segments of the data of relevance to our research question. And then these labels were then grouped to form particular themes, and we developed a thematic map, which we then further refine after discussion. We used purposive sampling to recruit journalists from each country, and that kind of gave us quite a diverse sample of 13 reporters, 14 editors and sub-editors, and 5 presenters, producers for some of the main national, independent and public service media. So going through findings, starting first again, structured, going back to literature on these main key themes relating to press freedom, is starting with the financial and economic pressure. Of course, this came as a major concern for all of our interviews from privately owned media in all 4 countries. So this was particularly, important for the beginning of the pandemic and lockdown, and we heard from interviewees that it actually gave a brutal blow to operation, and the state in Bulgaria, for example, did nothing to support the media. A lot of interviewees in Greece noticed that where there was some government funding for media outlets, the government actually directed that funding to media that didn't even exist, excluded others. So that was really, non-transparent and unfair. And in Cyprus as well, print media faced really big difficulties because with lots of drop in print sales, there was actually no government plan to support the press, and in the media basically joined the national economic support plan for reinforcing the industry during 2020. That helped actually a little bit with the employees' salaries and the broader private sectors. In Malta, later, the government actually committed to providing assistance to the press and announced a 500,000 euro fund. But, similarly to Bulgaria and Greece, the support was criticised by media houses, and that sort of lacked transparency in, everything the government was doing in that respect. When it comes to budgets, jobs and wages, the interviewees from Greece and Bulgaria did note that although the pandemic had a really important impact on the country's media industry, actually they did not have to do any major wage cuts or dismiss any unusual staff. In other words, they did manage. So there were periods where they were particularly difficult, but they did manage to rebound, by thinking of new strategies of how to produce new content, and trying to attract new audiences, and do their very best basically to stop that happening. For public service broadcasters, the situation is a little bit different. So journalists in those organizations were funded by government. So the pandemic didn't really impact their, they didn't pose any serious economic challenges for public service broadcasting journalists. But in Malta and Cyprus, it was slightly different. This is where our interview reported some cut in wages. So in Malta, for example, one of the interviewees said that they had to do a 20% pay cut across the board, and those that were higher paid got a bigger pay cut. But they had to get rid of some of the print extras. So in other words, that sort of slimmed down operation. In Cyprus, interviews reported that was really stressful, of course, having to cut off personnel. So that is generally reported across the board as a period of great uncertainty. But the dominant view really is that this tightening of media budget, it didn't actually affect personnel, those who were actually employed by media organizations, but it particularly hit freelance contributors who media organizations, 4 countries tend to use on media on a regular basis. So, in many cases, they had to actually stop using them. So the pandemic really had an impact on freelance journalists and any other contributors. Moving on to political pressures, political pressure in all 4 countries, studies clearly showed that it was significant even before the pandemic hit. So that political pressure intensified during the pandemic and beyond. So in all 4 countries, governments and other actors, corporate actors in many cases, use lots of ways and mechanisms, some of them subtle, others not so subtle, to limit the scope of reporting and to make basically one of the key findings is to make access to important information and data extremely difficult. And this is the type of information that journalists in all 4 countries really needed in order to do their jobs and, through reporting in the public interest. So that was particularly obvious in the beginning of the pandemic. So where governments excluded certain media outlets or allowing only the public service broadcasters today, not allowing journalists to ask questions directly. So, and generally, as one of the interviewee in Malta noted, so in terms of getting information from the government, they use the pandemic as an excuse to everything. And that, of course, has remained in all 4 countries beyond the pandemic. So at least at the time when the interviews were conducted in 2022. So another thing of note is this kind of culture of protecting governments at the time, those who were in power at the time, and to try and frame positively the government's effort to tackle the pandemic. So one journalist in Greece noted that it was actually almost like working in advertising. So it wasn't actually direct pressure, but it was understood, if you like, or made clear that this is the line we follow, and they had to keep doing what was doing before, namely praise the government. So that kind of, highlights the dependency, if you like, on politics. So that remained during the pandemic and beyond. So due to the lack of ability of journalists to access information, ask questions in Bulgaria, for example, journalists noted that lots of rules, procedures were passed without any media or public scrutiny. In other words, the media was not able to fulfill its role. So in Malta, again, interviews note lots of different tools, such as, for example, giving millions to support people who were losing their jobs, which translates to support for the government. And of course, people then forget, according to interviewee, what the government's doing. And of course, we have the context of Malta, which is quite unique. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we move on to safety context. So specific points here about post-pandemic context, getting used basically to avoiding media scrutiny during the pandemic. Then politicians learned to quickly or different ways to bypass traditional media and journalists altogether to avoid that questioning. So very common, a pattern was noted with interviews that instead of actually engaging with journalists, giving press conferences, that type of communication moving to one directions now, and journalists and in fact politicians tend to stream conferences on social media, common on Facebook, it was noted, and when there's any time if journalists were there to ask questions, they cut the transmission. So of course that was seen as very problematic by our interviewees. Legal challenges, a lot of our interviews, especially in Greece, were noted that threats of lawsuits or slaps, really made them anxious about that. So and that made them quite often self-censor because they were worried about getting into any kind of legal trouble. Journalists in Bulgaria also noticed that there's lots of, because of those legal cases, there's a form of pressure and a type of censorship. Also the case in Cyprus and in Malta. So in Malta, interviews are noticing the judicial system is abysmal. So it happens very, very often. And that, of course, puts additional threats to press freedom and the right to journalists to report the pandemic and beyond. And the findings in relation to safety issues across the board, actually, in 4 countries, participants didn't report any significant concern regarding their personal physical safety. But of course, this is the case of Malta is unique here. So physical safety really needs to be looked in the context, of course, of the 2017 assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia. So journalists in Malta were particularly concerned on that. So, all of our interviewees actually reported, fears in relation to their safety, that's physical safety, but also online threats. So we found that threats have actually moved to the digital sphere. Excuse me. And for many journalists, social media pressure is becoming really unbearable. So that was the kind of pressure that was noted for our interviewees in 4 countries. So because of that online, pressure, online abuse, and especially targeting female reporters, so lots of journalists tend to self-censor, and which is another big threat to press freedom. So just some conclusion here. So we found that, of course, the economic, financial fallout of the pandemic, exposed media organizations to very challenging and precarious conditions, and the crisis have actually made these worse, exacerbated these challenges. So we did notice some pay cuts for reporters and particularly for freelancers. It was really difficult for independent media to survive, to develop, and for the markets to grow, and that is still felt 2 years after the pandemic. The pandemic added these often subtle additional mechanism of control, whether that's a sponsorship scheme or other restrictions. And unfortunately, many of these had remained post-COVID. And that particularly relates to access to information. We found that all of interviews found very, very challenging. But in other words, governments in 4 countries almost had green cards to employ any means necessary to avoid scrutiny, and firstly to justify these restrictions on health and safety grounds, and later use those excuses. And particularly really was that, curb to access information that is vital for reporters. So we found that really in 4 countries, those 4 countries, the main perpetrators behind most of these threats were the governments, basically. So they took all legal, economic, and political means at their disposal to try and silence independent voices, and also to prevent criticism, especially on the way they handled the pandemic. And then 2 years later, in 2022, after the start of the pandemic, journalists seem to be resigned really to this new normality, in which their press freedom is constantly threatened. So our findings highlight that the state intervention really in any of the forms that I discussed here, whether that's political pluralism or threats to press freedom, as well as these already established mechanisms to interfere with and impact media outlets and journalism practice, not only in time of crisis, but continued in ordinary situations 2 years after the pandemic. So the study's implication really, we think, are relevant to lots of different countries, particularly in countries where journalism media face similar challenges. And I just wanted to note that if you are interested in the paper, I will share the link. The paper has just been published, open access. So, you're welcome to read it. I'll share the link in the chat. So thank you very much for listening. And that's for me. Thank you, William.